And there we go. I am delighted to welcome you to the online book launch for How to Get Your Teenager Out of Their Bedroom. If you have already ordered your copy, you've probably received it by now, you will already know quite a lot about me, probably more about me than before you started reading the books, because there's some very personal bits in there. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing myself. Other than just to say that my name's Anita Cleare. I am a parenting speaker, writer, and coach, and obviously I wrote this book. I would like to spend a little bit longer though, with Sophie introducing herself, because probably she's not someone that you necessarily are familiar with for many of you. So she's introduced herself and kind of get started really with the session. Sophie.
Sure. Thank you, Anita, for asking me to be here tonight, and congratulations to you on your book release. I'm sure it's an exciting and slightly nerve-wracking time. But listen, tonight I'm here primarily to interview you, but just to give a little bit of background about myself. So my name is Sophie Scott. I am an integrative psychotherapist. I work in private practice with adults. I should say, not with kids or teenagers. I'm also an entrepreneur. I've worked in the kind of wellness and industry for a long time. I founded Balance magazine, for anyone who may have remembered that from kind of being handed out on the underground. And I'm also an author, and my debut book, You're Not Alone in This: Supporting a Loved One's Mental Health Without Losing Your Own, is out in January 2025, and it is available to pre-order. So Anita, I think you very kindly mentioned that you would share the link. So yeah, thank you for that. And if that resonates at all, then please feel free to pre-order. But as I said, we're here for you and for your book tonight. So I wondered if you would sort of kick off, Anita, by just sharing what inspired you to write this latest book, because I know you've written books before.
Yeah, and I think it took me a while to get around to writing it because, to be really honest, I felt so buffeted by having parented through the teenage years, and we'd had quite a hard time. And I needed to get, first of all, a little bit of distance on that and to feel like I wasn't writing out of, my own experiences too deeply, or writing out of, that sense of how hard it had been. I wanted a bit more balance. And I got to a point where I started talking in the talks that I do in companies and with parents, and I started talking a bit more about teenagers. And the feedback I got from parents, with the being honest about what it feels like to be a parent, really talking about some of the strategies that I'd found helpful, that the research says is helpful. The feedback I got from parents was so wonderful. It was so actually, really quite surprising. Words like that was life changing, and that was revolutionized my relationship with my teenager. And I just thought, oh gosh, there is something here. There are other people out here, out there, who are also having a hard time, or who have had a hard time, and I might be able to give them something that I needed, which was a little bit of a guiding light, a few
Mm,
principles, just a little bit of empathy, if nothing
mm,
else, and a bit of hope to
mhm,
get them through. And I kind of got to the point where I was like, right, now I'm ready to do that. So it was really trying to offer that up to parents who might be in the thick of it or going
mm,
into that, and to be helpful and kind of provide some value and and some guidance.
mm. Well, I think that the book provides a lot of guidance. So I think you've done a great job. But I think maybe we could just take a step back for a moment, and perhaps you could set some context about what actually is going on for teenagers, sort of developmentally, physically, emotionally, what's going on mentally for them in their body and their brain.
Yeah, and that is key understanding. And I spend, one of the very first chapters in the book talking a lot about that,
Mhm,
because when we're able to look at our teenagers and understand a little bit of that, it does make it quite a bit easier to be patient and empathetic and perhaps respond in helpful ways. In the same way that, with toddlers, we look at toddlers and we know that there are certain things going on, like that need for independence, wanting to do it themselves, that trying to get control over their bodies and their worlds. And we can kind of look at that. And although they're still infuriating very often, that gives us that perspective. So in a nutshell, with teenagers, they are doing the equivalent of what toddlers are doing. So they've got a developmental piece of work to do. And I characterize that in the book as being about 4 drives. There are 4 kind of elements to becoming independent. So the overall goal is becoming independent. But inside that, there's a few different drivers. So we've got the kind of the need for separation, to kind of move away from parents, move outside the family umbrella, and separate in order to become independent. And then we've got the need to individuate, to become an individual, to explore, who am I? What is my identity as a, no longer as a child, but what's it going to be? What's the core essences of me? How do I behave? What do I do? What do I like? All of that exploration. And the third drive is assimilation, which is really fitting in with the peer group. How do I, outside this ecosystem of the family, when I separate out from that, how do I actually fit into the ecosystem of my peer group and of wider society? How do I work out the rules of that? And then autonomy, making decisions, taking that right to make decisions. And when we look at most teenage behavior, we can usually see at least one, not sometimes all of those drives are in play, and they're obvious ones. So parents will say to me, but yeah, my teenager is just sitting in his room gaming. He's not simulating. He's not doing any of that peer group stuff. And it's like, well, there's a couple of things going on there. So number one, he might be, because he's doing it in their terms, via a headset. But also, some of these things are a bit scary. When you need to individuate and assimilate, it's quite a frightening thing to accomplish, to do. And the natural response to that is actually to retreat and withdraw rather than go out into the world. And I think that's where the understanding of the brain comes in, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but in a real nutshell, the teenage brain is really prone to being threatened, to feeling threatened. So the mid part of the brain is kind of much more developed than the prefrontal cortex at the front, and they're not communicating very well until the brain kind of finishes its final upgrade. So what you get is a person whose kind of rational thinking brain drops in and out quite often, and whose emotional reward centers, threat centers are all hyped up. And hence, teenagers have that reputation for being very volatile and reactive. Being able to think, which part of their brain am I talking to right now, is a really helpful question. Is it their lovely, rational, sweet thinking self, or is it that slightly more kind of primitive, emotional side of them? And can I just wait until the other bit comes online? So it's thinking about, this is natural things. It might look slightly different in different teenagers, but they have a big project to do, which is to become independent. And most of what they're doing, that's what's going on one way or another.
That's so fascinating. And I'm curious, you said that some teenagers will react to that in different ways. Is there a difference between boys and girls generally? I'm just also thinking hormonally speaking.
Yeah, so there are tendencies for girls and boys to behave in slightly different ways. Now, we don't really know how much of that is nurture and how much of that is nature, because girls and boys are treated very differently from the adopt before they're born. We tend to kind of relate to them differently. So, for example, boys are a little bit more likely to be doing externalizing behavior, so risk-taking behavior, kind of taking whatever's going on inside them and going out and completely ignoring the rules and acting out with their friends, whereas girls have a greater tendency to internalize, to look in on themselves, and their feelings and their behaviors will be less externalized and more internalized. They are more prone to certain behaviors, around self-harm, for example, in that way, whereas boys might manifest those instincts by going and jumping off bridges into the river, for example. However, although we can observe this, I'm not sure it's always useful for parents because, frankly, it's only tendencies, and every teen is different. And ultimately, you may not have a teen who conforms to patterns. And it might be that if we think, oh well, boys are like this, we might not notice some of the things that are going on with them around anxiety or low mood, for example. We might think they're being aggressive when actually it is low mood that's driving their behavior. So my real advice is, throughout the book, have a relationship with your teenager. That's the most important thing you can do, rather than, I think sometimes when we think too much about patterns or gender, we start to project those. And really the most important thing is, what are they going through right now? What's going on with them? And that's the most important piece of work we have to do. And if you have, two teenage girls, they may have totally different experiences.
Yeah. But you do in the book talk about something called peer group adherence. Is that something that does impact, broadly speaking, all teenagers? And maybe you could just sort of explain a little bit more about what it means and why it's such a powerful force in adolescence.
Adherence is one of those kind of psychological terms that cover, it's quite a wide term that covers quite a lot. And if you talk to sort of evolutionary psychologists, they would talk about that we all need a herd in order to survive. Our chances of survival are much greater if we belong to a group. So if you're leaving the family and separating, you've got to find a group to belong to. And peer group adherence is actually about, how do teenagers stick to that group? They stick by working out the rules and sticking to them. So in my group, in my peer group, in my school, and they might have different groups that they have to kind of adhere to. In this group, these are the rules. We do it this way, and I have to stick to that in order to survive, to be part of this group, to not stand out, to be acceptable in some way. So it's a real driving force behind why teens always want the same bag as another, their friends, or they want to do the same things, particularly in those early teen years, because teenagers police their groups. And there's a fabulous book, and I don't know if anybody's read it, by Lucy Fawkes, has just written a book called Coming of Age. I think it's called Coming of Age, which is all about adolescence. And she really analyzes the hierarchies that you have in teenage groups, because teenagers police what isn't acceptable. And if you stand out, if you're different, you become vulnerable, therefore, to being excluded from the group or being lower in the hierarchy. And there's an awful lot of trying to find your place goes on in those teenage years, which can be incredibly difficult. And for parents watching it, we see our beautiful teenagers who are wonderful and fantastic and unique and just brilliant human beings, trying to narrow themselves down into some version that is the same as everybody else and still feeling bad about themselves. And that can be really hard, I think. So that peer group adherence that needs to fit in is it's a really strong drive for teenagers, so much so that they will police themselves in their heads. They mustn't like something because it's that imaginary peer group in their head. My friends wouldn't like it if they saw me doing this. It's a really powerful sort of psychological kind of phenomenon.
But it's been around well before the smartphone, right? Because I'm imagining that social media has just like compounded this sense of, what's cool, what's not cool, what I should look like, these WhatsApp groups. I mean, perhaps you could speak a little bit to that and how smartphone use works with peer group adherence. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Equally, I think we need to remember, if we all look back to our teenage years, and certainly my teenage years was pre smartphones, pre mobile phones at all, I felt that pressure. I felt, I would do whatever I needed to do to get the outfit that would make me acceptable at that particular point in time, especially when I was kind of about 13, was that real pressure to get it exactly right. So I think that's always existed. What the smartphones do is they amplify it an awful lot. Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Emma's just put the reference for the book. They amplify it and they mean that teenagers have no breaks, because certainly I had the opportunity to retreat as a teenager into my bedroom, for example, and practice who I wanted to be by myself. I could put my own posters on my wall. I could kind of have a little sanctuary. I had some spaces in which, in privacy, to try out myself. And teens today are so filmed. They're so reported in the self-reports that they do. There's so much feedback on, that's much harder for them to do. So it's that, I think it's just the constant stream of feedback that increases the anxiety of, am I getting this right, and not having the breathing spaces. But also the fashions can change really fast because the smartphones, literally, you could be doing a TikTok one day and it is, the viral TikTok, and the next day you could be laughed at for it. So you've got to stay in touch. You've got to constantly check the digital world to make sure you know what are the rules today, what's funny today, what's in today, what's out today, what happened, who's liked, who's not. So that real need to be constantly checking, I think that's how it amplifies it, rather than it was always there.
But then parents listening to this might be thinking, okay, what you're saying, absolutely, it's true, I buy it. So how am I going to convince my teenager that there's more to life than TikTok? How am I going to get them off? Because they have a very real need to keep going on it, remain current, to remain part of the peer group.
Yeah. Their friends live in their phones. It's not that their teens aren't addicted to making TikToks. They're addicted to their friends, to the feedback, to that integration that's going on in that moment. So, I do give some different strategies in the book about that. But the one thing that won't work is criticizing them. So if they're already anxious in their digital social lives about whether or not they're acceptable, likable, a worthwhile person, all of that, what they don't need is us turning around and nagging them and saying, oh, for goodness, you shouldn't think like that. Get off your phone, and making them feel criticized outside of that world as well. So I think that empathy, what you just did, that says, oh, I get it. I understand what's going on here. But also, I'm not sure it's really good for you to do that 24/7. I wonder what we could do to provide just a little bit of breathing space and respite. So some of it's about collaborating with them to kind of work with them. And some of it is about setting up traditions in your home that naturally provide breaks, whether that's meal times, no phones in bedrooms at night time, having those kind of sort of spaces, doing activities together where you can, trying to create natural breathing spaces. And especially if they're younger, having some boundaries that say, actually, at this time, this isn't going to happen. And, I'm not talking about imposing those on 18-year-olds who've already kind of made that transition, but making sure with younger teens, we are dragging our feet and going slowly when it comes to allowing them access to those things, allowing them time, rather than being, right at the front of their peer group. So I am absolutely for keeping younger teens, off smartphones for as long as possible. I think where we are at the moment, a lot of them have already got them. So what we've got to do is to work with them, rather than, we can't kind of just take those away at this stage. But the idea that going to schools, they would have a break from them is fantastic. I've been saying for years that phones should not be allowed in schools during the school day. And that is a brilliant time for them to get respite for it. So creating those spaces, I think, is one of the biggest things we can do. And modeling behavior,
Well, we'll come on to that a little bit later. I think, kind of modeling that emotional regulation. But you touched very briefly just then on anxiety. And I think we should talk about mental health in adolescence, because it's a period when so many mental health issues start. In fact, half of all lifetime mental illnesses start by the time somebody is 14. But of course, most, or yeah, a lot, the majority go undetected. So, parents might be listening in on this and wondering, well, hang on, how do I distinguish between, like, typical teenage behavior and actually signs that there is something maybe more serious going on? I'm keen to know what your thoughts are on kind of diagnosis during the teenage years. You know, Possibly there's some overdiagnosis now of certain conditions. I think particularly ADHD and even autism and anxiety. But I'd be really keen to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, the problem is it's incredibly difficult to tell the difference between what is normal teenage behavior and what are the signs of perhaps an emerging or an underlying mental health condition or disorder. And when you look at the diagnostic criteria and you read, the diagnostic criteria for depression, I think sometimes what you see there, it's like, but yeah, that's every teenager. That's mood swings. That's not sleeping regular hours. That's eating at odd times, perhaps having a poor attitude to things. It's like these can be very normal as well. I think assuming that most teens have a bit of a hard time is a really good place to start, because it's not an easy period and they are vulnerable. So starting from that point that says most behavior of teenagers, if it's problematic, it's probably a sign that they're having a hard time. But there's a massive difference between a hard time and something that we need to diagnose or even necessarily to seek help for. And I think Lisa D'Amour is really good on this when she talks about her book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. She talks about the fact that if a teenager is having an emotion or a feeling or is in a state that makes sense. So, for example, if they've got exams coming up, or they've got a date or a party, or something is happening, or they've got a friendship problem, and if they're feeling emotional, maybe feeling anxious, feeling nervous, or worrying about something, that makes sense. And if they are also using some kind of coping mechanism that is not harmful, we might not appreciate their coping mechanism. We might not recommend it. We might think, well, that's the wrong one, because they might be, I don't know, listening to sad music or going on long walks, or I don't, doing things that we think, well, that's not very positive, is it? Or they might be, sort of just behaving or just crying. And we might think, well, stop it. Actually, if that's providing relief, helping them manage their emotions, and it's not doing any harm, then probably they are just being a teenager. This is not, it's not easy to watch as a parent, but probably there's nothing to worry about. If it tips over where they're using harmful coping mechanisms, whether that is, drugs, alcohol, self-harm, doing something which actually is having a negative impact, or the level of their emotion or is interfering with everyday life. They're not able to go to school. They're having kind of panic attacks. They're not able to do the things other teenagers are doing. That's the point at which they probably need support of some sort. So I think in a really fictional way, assuming they're all having a bit of a hard time because they're teenagers, but are they managing those emotions in an okay way? And, what level of support do they need? It can be confusing because, teenage emotions can just be things like lashing out at us. And of course, we then want to react to that and see that as disrespect rather than as a expression of having a difficult time of something else. But it's really hard. But I think, and I do offer some kind of pointers in the book, but think about how long is it going on for, how much is it interfering, and how well are they coping with it, is to kind of give yourself a benchmark.
That makes a lot of sense. I talk about sort of PPI, which is, how persistent is it, how pervasive is it, and what's the level of impairment to somebody or a teenager. Those are useful frameworks, but still I would imagine some parents are listening in thinking, well, I don't exactly know what they're doing behind their closed door. And I think that can give, quite a degree of anxiety to the parent, Um, how can parents find out, if they're doing, things that are not good and not healthy, self-harm you mentioned, for example? How do they go about finding out?
Certainly the only way is relationship. And then the book is all about relationship and
Yeah.
how you build one. Because if a teenager wants to hide something from you, they probably will successfully manage to do so. And
Hmm.
yes, there may be times where taking kind of very draconian action and searching their bedroom or, doing those kind of sleuthing might be appropriate if you think there's a real risk of harm here. But the fact is, if they don't want you to know, they will probably do a very good job of hiding it. So relationship is the only way forward. And I do think sometimes providing, number one, providing opportunities for conversation. So I talk loads in the book about how do we build on the little micro bridges to kind of find moments, excuses, opportunities to talk, and being brave and tentative at the same time. So perhaps being able to say, it might just be me. I'm your mum. I do worry a lot. I know I do. And sometimes I worry about things and there's nothing to worry about. But I've noticed that you seem to be, a bit low at the moment, or that you seem to not be seeing your friends anymore. And I wondered if there was a reason for that, or, what was going on there. And, maybe you seem a little bit low on the outside. I was wondering if that's how it feels on the inside.
Mm.
So providing opportunities for conversations and then trying to go in them in a really non-threatening, non-accusatory, kind of gentle way. But relationship is what will make the difference
Mm.
ultimately.
I think that's so helpful just to even hear you sort of model what a conversation or an approach might sound like. Because of course, some people will be listening to this saying, I would love to have a relationship with my child, but I feel so disregarded by them. They don't want to, have a relationship with me. They don't appreciate me. I'm invisible, after all I've done for them. What would you say to those parents?
That's what it feels like. And, it's true. Being the parent of a teenager, we can feel so many things. But that's our responsibility, not theirs. And I think
Mm.
that's the big distinction, that we can be feeling old, we can be feeling rejected, we could be feeling shame, that we think, oh my goodness, my teenager's not turned out, well in some way. Or we could be feeling blame on ourselves, that somehow because they're struggling, that must be our fault in some way. All of those things might be going on. We could be just feeling ignored, like we give our lives, our energy, our love, our everything to our kids. And then suddenly there comes a point where they just don't want it and need it. But that is the moment we need to take responsibility for ourselves, for our side of the transition. So they are going through a transition, and so are we. And our side of the transition, we need to take, and we need to say, okay, I need to deal with that bit. I need to deal with my emotions, my thoughts, my habits. I need to go get a life, maybe, whatever it
Mm.
is. I need to find a new hobby. I need to do
Mm.
something. That's my bit to do. It's not their job to validate me at this stage. Now, I'm pretty certain that most teenagers turn into young adults who turn around and they love you to pieces and think you did a reasonably good job,
Hmm.
but they're not going to do it in the thick of the teenage years. So at that moment, we've got to find that validation, be heard and seen in other ways and by other people.
I love that. I have to say, totally echoes my approach in my own book. You cannot put all of your investment and your eggs and your energy into any one relationship or thing in your life. So, Anita, I'm wondering if this is a good point for you to read an extract from the book.
But I do have an
Yeah.
extract, and if anybody's got the book with them, you're more than welcome to read along. So I was going to read this is from chapter 2, which is about being a parent and what it feels like. It's on page 28 if you've got the book. It's called All the Feelings All at Once. And when I first wrote this, it was a lot longer. It was one of those writing experiences where I just gushed. I just kind of put all the feelings down there of everything I had ever felt being the parent of a teenager. And then I edited it and made it quite a bit shorter and not quite as personal as that. But, you know, hopefully, and Sophie, I don't want to frighten you because I know you haven't got teenagers.
I've got a toddler.
All the feelings all at once. The teenage years can shake parents to the core. The suddenness of that change from sweet, goofy child to stroppy teen can throw us totally off kilter. Maybe we thought we were doing a half decent job at parenting for the last 10 years or so. Kids were happy and well behaved and trying hard at school. And then the teenage years come along and everything seems to come tumbling down. Perhaps it's because of the enormity of the risks they face. It can feel like our children's entire lives hang in the balance in these few short years. One wrong turn into drugs or alcohol or hanging with the wrong crowd blight their futures forever. Then there are the dangers that lurk online. We can't see these digital threats, but unlike us, they have a direct line to our teens' attention. We're desperate to shepherd them safely through it all, but our previously compliant child now throws all our advice straight back at us, or simply turns off their ears and ignores us. So our anxiety grows. We might feel shame that our teen has turned out badly, or self-blame that their struggles must be our fault. We look around us and see other teens doing well. We scroll past happy family snaps on social media of other people's teens having dinner with their parents, out walking with them, seeing, smiling. Well, our own teenager won't spend a microsecond longer with us than is strictly necessary. And then there is the loss of the child that we have spent a whole decade getting to know, the child who adored us and loved us deeply. They are gone forever, transformed into a bigger, clumsier version. Our company is no longer wanted. We aren't even allowed to hang around with this new person for scraps of intimacy. With their friends, they might be gregarious. With us, they clam up tight. It is a profound rejection by one of the people we love most in the world, and into whom we have poured a lifetime's worth of love and nurturing. Yeah, big feelings, really big feelings. And I'm not sure, I think what I tried to do, this sounds a little bit authorly, but what I tried to do in the book was to hear the reader and to be the person who was validating and empathizing with what they were going through, and to be able to say, I see you, I see how much this hurts, I see how hard you're trying, how outraged you feel. And I tried to include spaces where readers would feel validated and heard by me, hopefully also to model that they could then go and do that to their teenagers.
Yeah. Firstly, that's really beautiful, that reading, and it made me sort of feel like I was going to well up, especially as you say, because I have a toddler and I think, my God, that's not going to happen. But you do such a good job of that, I think, in the book, of kind of straddling both speaking and empathizing with the reader, but also with the teenager. I'm interested because, you know, hearing that, I also didn't myself have a really sort of typical teenagehood. I had a significant bereavement when I was 14. And so I'm wondering what that means. You know, in a sense, I didn't have anything to rebel against. So I became very self-reliant. And there may be people listening to this who don't have kind of like typical family structures. And how can different types of parents or caregivers who might be listening help teens who don't have that sort of 2.4 family setup, or may have experienced bereavements, or, you know, whatever it is, traumas themselves in their teenagehood, how can they support those types of teenagers? Would it be a different approach, do you think?
I don't actually know the answer to the question in some ways. I know what I experienced. I also didn't have a particularly ideal um, kind of teenage years, and I was also quite a rebellious teenager in
Mm-hmm.
the sense that I did lots of acting out, lots of risk taking, most of it coming from that place of hurt and trying to deal with myself. And it took me a long time to do that. I really struggled with the teenage years, and I thought I dealt with that until I was faced with a teenager who was
Mm,
struggling. And at that point, it undid me because all of my past teenage hurts and needs, unmet needs, came crowding in to what was already a difficult situation.
mm,
So, watching a hurt teenager, I felt like a hurt teenager myself. All of that was coming crashing,
mm,
in,
mm,
whilst I was also a mum who was going through emotions at the same time. And I don't know the answer to how we manage that, but I think with most things, recognizing it in yourself, being able
mm-hmm,
to go into that situation and say, okay, this is really interesting. I didn't have a great model for mothering. So how am I going to go about doing this? I
mm,
wonder how that will affect me, and being a little bit kind and curious with ourselves about that. Because if we can notice things, I think the point at which I noticed what was hurting me was my own teenage hurt, I could then go, okay, maybe I need to take that somewhere and
mm,
deal with that
mm,
in some way. So I think just being aware of how our own teenage experiences might impact is the first step on that, so that we can stay the grown up in the relationship
mm,
with our actual teenager.
mm. I couldn't agree with you more. I think everything starts with awareness. And of course, it is so important because teenagers, whilst they want to separate from their parents, they also still look to them for everything. So, for parents to be able to learn what it is to emotionally regulate themselves and to be able to model that for their teenagers, for their kids. You know, have you got any tips on how parents can be mindful of their own sort of unhelpful thoughts, or we call them cognitive distortions in therapy, and their own kind of responses, emotional responses, so that they can model that healthier communication for their teens?
When it comes to unhelpful thoughts, it's a bit of a car crash, really, the teenage years, because it's so often, well, for women, coincides with, perimenopause or menopause, and naturally heightened anxiety, for example, sleeplessness. So that particularly the catastrophic thinking of over interpreting what's going on now. So often what happens is something goes on with our teenager. Maybe they're not studying very hard at the moment. Maybe their grades are dropping. Maybe, actually we've just found out that they're drinking vodka in the local park, but something is going on. And before we know it, we have got on that train of worrying way into the future, where we've basically written them off. They're never going to get a job. They're never going to get to college. They're going to become an alcoholic. All of these things start going around our heads. I kind of like to think, number one, notice it. I'm worrying. This is what I'm thinking about. And then say, okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of space, thoughts. Okay.
Mm,
I've got some worried thoughts. You're fine. You're welcome to be in my head. Sit yourself down, make yourself at home. However, I'm not going to give you all the space, because what I really need to think about is not the future. You can sit there, wait, we'll deal with you when the future happens. Right now, I need to think about now. So, what is it about now that I can do? So, I think rather than trying to oust thoughts, just being able to recognize them and say, yeah, I'm worried about their future. I'm worried that they're going to end up an alcoholic, drop out, and everything is going to go pear-shaped, and I'm going to feel like an awful person. That's what I'm worried about. Fine. Sit yourself down, thought, let's actually think about what's happening right now, and let's go back to that. The only bit we can do anything. And try to do that. And it sounds easy when you say it, and it's so easy to do. But try and focus on the present and small bits of progress, and find the positives about the present. Find the thing today that was actually good, whether it was a cuddle or a smile or a tiny thing that they did that made you think, oh, you know what? It's not all going completely wrong. You know, find those little glimmers and try and focus on those too and give them a bit of space.
That's beautiful. And again, I wonder if it comes back down to, you know, in a sense, the happier that we can be in our own lives, the more fulfilled, you know, then we are a type of role model for them, even if it's not directly communicated by osmosis. Somehow they may pick up on that.
Just being the grown up, remembering
Yeah.
to be the grown up, not to descend to being the teenager and joining in the teenage communication. Be the grown up and invite them into that relationship with you, into that form of communication.
Anita, I'm dying for another extract. Do you want to? Would you have another one that you could read for us?
It's a really short one, this, and it builds on this idea of micro bridges. So I talk a lot in the book about how to find little moments of connection. You know, we're not expecting that our teens are going to spend, you know, hours and hours and days with us necessarily. Just finding the tiny little moments of connection, and those we have to look for them and we have to treasure them. And this was inspired. This kind of, well, it was inspired by two things, this reading. One of them was a real event, a real hill, a real complaining teenager. And the other thing was a lovely little phrase in, I think, Richard Osman's first detective book he wrote, which was the idea of a pebble, a memory being a pebble that you put in your pocket and you just hold it. Because I always do that with conkers. I pick up conkers and I put them in my pocket and I hold them. And it really appealed to me, that tactile sense of that's what I'm going to hold on to. So, and this is, if you are reading along, is page 57. So it's about persuading a reluctant teen to spend time with you. So set aside your own sense of outrage and search out the small rewards among the sullenness and eye rolling. Just let those go. Remember, spending one-to-one time with a teenager is about reminding them that you are still there, still caring, and saving their place in this relationship for them. If you can be flexible and go with their flow in order to oil the wheels of your time together, you're far more likely to stumble upon the little bridges that do lead to connection. Yes, they may have moaned the whole time walking up that hill. They may have complained about the weather or their shoes or having to be there at all. That one moment when you stand looking at the view from the top of the hill and they huddle up to you to shield themselves from the wind and tolerate a cuddle, that's the moment to put in your pocket and treasure. That's the moment to replay in your head and squeeze all you can out of. That one moment of closeness that says, I know you're still here for me. Those are the moments that matter.
Oh, that's beautiful. Anita, thank you so very much. We've got just 15 minutes. I've just sort of caught sight of the time. So I think rather than me ask any more questions, I would really love to turn to the audience. And so Emma, I think you're going to very kindly moderate the Q&A. So I will go on mute now.